So we're going to talk about the National Fire Protection Association. So what is the NFPA? Well, it's a nonprofit organization. It's not just based in the United States, but it's international. And they try to set standards for fire codes and standards for fire and rescue responders to help set everybody up for success. So they ultimately have made more than 300 codes and standards that try to look at the various different industries and responses for fire teams and go through in some detail to try to set that up and clarify clarify standards of how that stuff should all be set up. So each one of these standards has a number, right? So they're called NFPA 1, 2, 3, whatever. These standards you should think of as a book, right? And it really varies from one to another, but oftentimes these things are in the neighborhood of 100 or more pages. And they're on a lot of different topics here. The ones that are most pertinent directly to swiftwater rescue are NFPA 1006 and NFPA 1670. There's also 1983, which has to do with equipment, but we won't really talk about that today. There are a lot of other standards that rescue equipment has to apply to as well. That one is in there. It's worth knowing that it's there, but we're not going to talk about it. So we'll start with 1006, which is a standard that applies to individual rescuers. So I'll start off by saying that these standards are they're redone every 4 years or so. What I have on the screen here is 2017. The 2021s have I think just recently come out, and in the 2021s, the vehicle rescue chapter has been broken into 2 chapters. So now there's passengers and heavy vehicles or something like that. So there's an extra chapter in there. And I should also mention that all these standards are available for free online. You can't download them or anything, but you can view them online. To actually purchase them or to download them is fairly expensive, but they are viewable online for free. Let's see. So 1006 applies to individual rescuers. So we can see all the different chapters there about how individual rescuers should be prepared for various different challenges they might come across. The subdisciplines, as far as water rescue goes, there's 6 chapters that are relevant. Obviously, Swiftwater is the one that we're most focused on. So we'll spend our time on that. But there are these other 5 chapters that also relate to other versions of water rescue. So in that Swiftwater rescue chapter, we'll see that this is broken into 3 different levels: the 17.1, 0.2, and 0.3, awareness, operations, and technician. And those are the different levels of standard that the NFPA lays out for individual rescuers. So when we get into the detail of each of these chapters, it gets pretty weedy pretty fast. It's set out, all these standards are set out in a way that is pretty logical, thoughtful, and definitely makes sense. The outline is incorporated into the structure here: 17.1, 17.11, with requisite knowledge and skills in each one of these. 17.2 goes to operations. It's a pretty logical setup, but it also is pretty weedy and wordy. We won't get too deep into the reading all the words here, but just know that this is more or less what it looks like. I'll summarize each of these. The awareness level kind of is the introductory level for each one of these specialties. So this is kind of just like a few hours of like trying to get a basic understanding of what the challenge of responding to a particular type of rescue would be, and recognizing the need for it, and calling in the right people and making sure that you can stabilize and not let things get worse by sizing it up and seeing safety zones and such like that. At the operations level, there's obviously more training involved for people to get to an operations level. And then these folks are actually supporting rescue operations, and they might move, they might actually perform non-entry rescues, which is to say not a go rescue, not actually jumping in the water. But, you know, bank rescues, throwing throw bags, such like that, involved in rope rescue systems. And that might be a day or a little bit more, something like that. And then technician level is obviously, you know, several to many days of training to get to the technician level in the swiftwater discipline. So the details there, obviously, that you actually have to be a technician level in one of the other disciplines in the surface water criteria, perform the entry rescue, what we would call a go rescue, and then be able to swim designated swiftwater course representative of the swiftwater within the response area. So that's a little bit squishy because it depends on what the response area is as to what that requirement actually is, and also be able to perform rescues from a boat. Great. Then 1670, NFPA 1670. I know I'm covering that up a little bit there. There we go. Is that better? NFPA 1670 is designed to measure a response team's readiness. So, and we see that the chapter set up for this this standard 1670, which of course is its own book, like the 1006 is a 100 and some page book. The 1670 is its own book that is split into the same chapters with the same basic structure, where there's general requirements, awareness, operations, and technician level within each one of these disciplines. And so this is what applies to actually measure response teams' readiness. Okay. No, geez. Come on, come back. There we go. All right. So again, within that Swiftwater search and rescue chapter, yeah, general requirements, awareness, operations, and technician. So if we get into one of those actual chapters, we can see they're much shorter here for the requirements for the team responsiveness. Readiness, I should say. But we can get into a little bit more detail here. So we see 17.1 as general requirements. So organizations operating in swiftwater search and rescue incidents, kind of regardless of what level they're operating at, shall meet the requirements specified in Chapter 4. All right, fine. So if we go back and we look here, Chapter 4 says, oh yeah, there's all the general requirements. And so what does all that say? So we have to meet all those standards. That means basically awareness level for all hazards, and then a bunch of kind of procedural things, having training, documentation, hazard identification, SOPs, risk assessment, all these kinds of protocols and procedures for responding to any technical rescue. Then to respond at the awareness level for swiftwater rescue, then the actual team, each member has to be a competent person. And that's again referenced back to Chapter 3.321. That's in the definitions, general definitions. So what is a competent person? That's somebody who's capable of identifying existing predictable hazards, who has authorization to take prompt corrective measures. Okay, so that just means people have a base level of understanding, They can identify basic hazards, and they can make changes to make the situation better. So in order for a team to be operating at the awareness level, each person has to meet that criteria. Beyond the competent person, the organization, beyond each member being a competent person, the organization, organizationally, they have to implement procedures to recognize the need, implement assessment phase, identify necessary resources, et cetera, recognize and mitigate hazards. So these are structural team response, team level responses for responding to swiftwater rescue incidents. When we step up a level to the operations level, organizations have to meet the requirements for surface water and vehicle. And again, that's going to be broken down into 2 chapters now, operations level. So this is referring back to some other chapters. And so in order to meet the standards of operations in 1670, a team has to also meet the standards for operations in other disciplines as well. And then members, the individual responders within that team, must meet the operations level for 1006 in swiftwater rescue. And then the team has to provide minimum PPE, helmet, thermal protection, knife, et cetera. We move up to the technician level. And then we'll see pretty quickly that the organizations have to meet the requirements for that vehicle technician level. So again, referring back to other chapters, all the individual rescuers have to be at the technician level for swiftwater rescue. And then let me get myself, whoops, oh geez, where we go? The organization has to be prepared to have procedures for rope rescue in swiftwater, pertinent and building rope rescue anchors, mechanical advantage, tension diagonals, high lines, all the kind of rope systems that are relevant for moving boats and rescuing in swiftwater environments. And then also, if using human-powered or motorized watercraft, they have to be prepared to do that as well. So one of the questions I often hear people ask is, do fire departments have to comply with NFPA standards? And it's a tricky one because there isn't really, NFPA certification. That's not really the way this works. But fire departments don't necessarily have to comply with NFPA. A lot of departments would rather tailor their training and their response protocols to their local needs rather than follow standards that are set up kind of more broadly. But there are some OSHA compliant state agencies that require NFPA compliance. And so in some cases, they're required to comply. That just depends on the actual department and their setup with all the other agencies that they work with. If there is an accident or a line of duty death, departments that don't follow NFPA standards could also be exposed to more legal liability, maybe, or at least there's some question about that. And so many choose to fall in line with the NFPA standards for that reason, but many don't. And it's not an all or nothing. They may choose to comply with many parts of NFPA standards, be in compliance with many parts of the NFPA standards, and not with others. What about individuals? Do individual firefighters have to comply with NFPA standards? Again, the answer is not necessarily. Firefighters have to meet the standards of the department that they work for. And so that department may determine that they want firefighters to meet the NFPA standards. If that's true, then they have to. If that department does not decide that, then they don't have to. So firefighters oftentimes trained by the department they get hired by. maybe they were trained by a previous department or maybe a third-party training organization. Any of those may or may not be NFPA compliant. Any of that training may or may not be NFPA compliant. If the training is NFPA compliant, then it may or may not be accredited. This gets further tricky here because most training organizations forego any kind of accreditation, which then just means that a training organization says, hey, you know, we've established our training protocols in compliance with NFPA standards. We've trained these people in compliance with those standards. And then the firefighter will say, hey, look, I've been trained to those standards. But there's no certification that ultimately will stamp, you know, that will say that that's the case. The exception to that is that there are some training organizations that are accredited by the Pro Board Fire Service Professional Qualification System, whatever, Pro Board. And that in those training organizations have trainers and then separate assessors. And those evaluators come in, and then they're actually able to give a stamp and say, hey, this has been approved by the Pro Board, which is accredited by the NFPA, and blah, blah, blah. And so that's another level of kind of security that the training is actually in line with the NFPA standards. Some departments require that, some don't. Some people like to have Pro Board certification because they find they get hired faster, or they can move up through the ranks quicker, they can move to different departments more easily, all those kinds of reasons. But of course, all that comes at a cost. And it doesn't really promote training specific to a response area. So arguably beneficial, or maybe actually not beneficial at all. But you know, either way, you can see arguments either way, and that's the deal with that, basically. Okay, so I want to spend some time looking at reasons why the NFPA seems confusing. For crying out loud. Here we go. Well, whatever. Why the NFPA can seem confusing. And one of those reasons is that there are an awful lot of references to other standards. Let's just take a quick look at what that looks like. So in 1006, so that's for individuals, Chapter 17, Swiftwater Rescue, fine. At the technician level, they lay out the job performance requirements, JPRs. And they say, oh yeah, look, you know, you have to meet the requirements defined in order to meet the technician level for Swiftwater Rescue. You also have to meet the job performance requirements defined in 16.3.1 through 16.3.4, 17.2, 17.3, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so fine. So let's look at that. So we go to 16.3. All right, that makes sense. We go to 17.2, that makes sense. We go to 17.2 also references 16.1 and 16.2.1 and 17.1. Okay, so then we have to make sure that we're covered in 16.1, 16.2. Yes, also 17.1, 17.2. Yeah, and then also 17.3. You know, this is all like fairly convoluted, where there's a lot of referencing back and forth. You know, there's this book, this water rescue book, that is really supposed to be kind of the guide to navigating all these water disciplines in NFPA, and trying to make some sense of them. It's an interpretation, essentially. But even within this book that is the interpretation that's supposed to be easier reading, it still has this appendix. It's like, oh, look, well, you know, how do you, like, where do these different standards correspond, and how does it all lay back and forth? And it really is still a very convoluted process. However, that said, let me explain this. The reason why it's convoluted is because it's not really designed for somebody to come in midway and say, like, oh, look, my goal is to become a technician level. Because when you look at it from that perspective, then all of a sudden you're referred back to all these other disciplines, and it's really difficult to make sense of. However, if you come in the other direction from the base level and get base level training and say, oh, look, like, hey, I've gotten this general requirements training, I've gotten this awareness level training, and then what's the next step after that, next step after that? From that perspective, it all makes really good sense, because then as you get higher levels up, look backwards, it says, oh, you have to have met this, this. Then of course you're like, check, check, check. I've already done all of those things. And instead of reiterating all of those, and then instead of having to change all of those every time there's any kind of update, that referencing back makes a lot of really good sense. It just, if you're trying to look ahead and set goals and try to establish, how do I get to this point later on, then it's super convoluted. Okay. One of the other confusing things about the NFPA is that it's intentional vagueness. Let me give you some examples. So again, 17.3.2. So one of the requirements for this is from 2006. So negotiate a designated Swiftwater course, given a course that's representative of the bodies of Swiftwater existent or anticipated within the geographic confines of the authority having jurisdiction. So it doesn't really tell you what kind of swimming this. So what this means, let me interpret. What this means is that you need to be able to swim through some whitewater. And it doesn't really say what kind of whitewater. It doesn't say what class of whitewater, how you need to navigate through it, how wide it is, how deep it is, how swift it is, whether you need to be able to catch eddies or ferry or just defensively swim or aggressively swim. There's no real clarity, and you could make arguments that that there's a lot of different levels that would make sense. Similarly, when we look at the rope systems, then it says construct rope systems particular to the swiftwater rescue needs of the authority having jurisdiction. Again, like very vague. And this is intentional because they don't want to place an undue burden on agencies that say, yeah, well, we need to be trained to respond to swiftwater incidents. But the truth of it is we really only have irrigation canals, and we don't have much topography. We have really flat land and irrigation canals, and we need to be able to respond to those. But we don't need to train to swim in class 4 whitewater, and we don't need to build high lines across gorges, because that just isn't what happens here. Okay, fine, that makes really good sense. So then those agencies can respond as technician level agencies, and they can even have technician level compliant individuals on their teams. But the tricky part is that person who's compliant as an individual working in one area then might move to a different agency, to a different department in a different geographic area, and suddenly not be compliant with the requirements in a different geographic area. Or you might go to a training, a third-party training in a different area that trains to the specifics of the area where the course is, which may not be the requirements for the actual area that a responder works in. So those things are tricky. It's intentionally vague for a reason, which I think makes really good sense. But it so for better and for worse, that allows the agencies to hold the standard while not being unduly burdened. But it also means that there needs to be some interpretation. Oh my goodness, acronyms and numbers aplenty. These things are rife in the NFPA. I just randomly picked out a whatever standard and just like closed my eyes and pointed and came across NFPA 1521. This is not any standout exception. This is pretty normal. And so it says, determine the need for hazardous material technician trained ISO or assistant ISO given the hazardous material incident 29 CFR 1910 120 NFPA 472 NFPA 1072 AHJ SOP/G for hazardous material operations. So the IC can appoint an assistant ISO. I mean, if you're steeped in this system, then this might make really good sense. But if you're new, this is really difficult to decipher. It's just a constant maze of technical jargon that is, 10 codes to the 10th. So whatever, there it is. It's efficient, is better than repeating all of that stuff in every one of these sentences. But it is also super, super difficult to decipher. And then lastly, committees and documents. So many committees and documents. Each one of these standards has their own committee. Each one of these committees, every time they meet, they make different documents, and they have all this stuff that's on the NFPA website. Each standard creates job performance requirements, and they analyze the jobs, and they try to come up with what everybody needs to be able to do in all their jobs. And it is like super, super bureaucratic. Again, they're like making pretty good efforts to try to establish standards so that to raise the professionalism of responders without necessarily like handcuffing people to undue burdens that don't apply in the areas where they're working. That's difficult to do. And so it requires having a lot of different representation from a lot of different areas on a lot of different committees. And there are so many committees. Oh, yes. So I think it's just worth knowing that it's, if somebody is steeped in this system, it can really effectively cover a vast amount of information really, really quickly. It can be organized really well. But the tricky part is that implementation is everything, right? Of course. And so used as a platform to help develop judgment and expertise, this is a system with an enormous amount of experience that informs it. Great. But if it's used as a rigid system that's shallowly understood and cannot be adapted to the needs at hand, it becomes dogma of the very worst kind. And so that's the kind of pros and cons of it. I think it's worth us understanding this stuff from the perspective of Swiftwater, because in the Swiftwater world, there aren't any other real definitive umbrella organizations that define standards for rescuers or for a team's readiness. And firefighters do an awful lot of professional Swiftwater rescue out there. Certainly guides do some, and SAR teams do some, but firefighters do a big portion of it. And so these NFPA standards are worth Swiftwater rescuers being informed about, so that you know how it's done professionally in the world, and can interact with those folks. Okay.